A single machine sat on a folding table, a relic of a dead-ended history. It was September 2004, and the humid air of the Georgetown flea market hung thick with the smell of old wood and fried food. Amidst chipped porcelain dolls and tarnished silverware, the Enigma machine commanded a silent authority. Its black bakelite casing and rows of circular keys seemed to absorb the light around it, a compact block of secrets from a world of shadows and whispers. This wasn't just an antique, it was a weapon from a forgotten war, a mechanical brain designed to encrypt the fates of nations. It felt profoundly out of place, a dormant predator resting among the mundane trinkets of peaceful lives, waiting for a signal that had been lost to time for over 60 years. Dr. Ethan Hayes moved through the crowded aisles without purpose, a man adrift in his own quiet weekend routine. A history professor in his 40s, he was more at home in the hushed archives of a university library than in the chaotic bustle of a public market. His life was a carefully curated collection of facts and footnotes, a deliberate fortress against the messy uncertainties of the past. He wasn't a collector, nor was he searching for anything specific. He was simply walking, letting the flow of the crowd carry him along, his mind preoccupied with lecture notes and academic deadlines. Then his eyes fell upon the machine, and the structured, predictable rhythm of his day came to an abrupt halt. It was a dark, magnetic pull from across the years. The connection was immediate and visceral, a jolt that bypassed logic and reason entirely. He approached the table slowly, as if drawn by an invisible thread. The vendor, a grizzled man with a weary smile, watched him with passing interest. Ethan reached out, his fingers tracing the cold, smooth contours of the keys, each one a stark white letter on a black background. A strange phantom sensation prickled at his subconscious, a feeling of misplaced familiarity, like hearing a song from a dream. The price was mentioned, a figure that was both exorbitant and utterly irrelevant. Without a moment of hesitation, without the customary negotiation, Ethan agreed. He knew with a certainty that chilled him that he was not just buying an object. He was reclaiming a piece of a life he had forced himself to forget. The weight of the Enigma machine was significant as he carried it back to his car. Tucked inside a sturdy canvas bag, it felt like a heavy stone, a tangible piece of the very history he taught. The purchase was an anomaly, a complete deviation from the careful, methodical man he had become. He was a scholar who dealt in verifiable truths, in primary sources and peer-reviewed analysis. This act, however, was driven by pure, unanalyzed impulse. Back in the quiet solitude of his suburban home, he placed the machine on the floor of his study. The house, usually a sanctuary of academic order, suddenly felt different. The Enigma sat there like an unexploded ordnance, a dark visitor from a past he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun, a silent testament to a family narrative built on shame and silence. His study was a world of polished mahogany and the comforting scent of aging paper, a room where history was tamed and catalogued. He lifted the heavy machine and set it carefully on his desk, its stark, utilitarian form, a stark contrast to the leather-bound books and neatly stacked papers that surrounded it. For several long minutes, he did nothing but look at it. The silence in the room seemed to deepen, amplifying the machine's brooding presence. It was more than a complex calculator of secrets. It was a puzzle box crafted in an era of paranoia and betrayal. It was a physical link to the Cold War, a period that for most was an abstract chapter in a textbook, but for Ethan, it was the source of a wound that had never truly healed, the backdrop to his father's disappearance and disgrace. A few days passed before he decided to clean it. The task felt grounding, a way to interact with the object on his own terms. He approached it with the patience of a restorer, using soft cloths and delicate brushes to wipe away the decades of accumulated dust and grime. He meticulously polished each of the glass keytops, cleaned the intricate wiring of the plug board, and carefully removed the 3 rotors, examining their complex internal wiring. It was during this intimate, tactile examination that his thumb brushed against a subtle irregularity on the machine's base. It was a thin, almost invisible line in the metal, a seam so perfectly crafted it was nearly indistinguishable from the original construction. It wasn't damage from age or use. It felt intentional, a hidden scar. His academic curiosity, now fully aroused, took over. He retrieved a magnifying glass and a small toolkit from his desk drawer, his earlier hesitation replaced by a focused intensity. The seam was not an accident of manufacturing. It was a deliberate modification, a secret door. Using the fine edge of a flathead screwdriver, he gently probed the line, applying careful pressure until he felt a faint click. A tiny rectangular panel, no larger than his thumbnail, popped open, revealing a small, hollowed-out cavity within the machine's solid base. Inside, nestled among a few modern-looking wires, was a single, tiny toggle switch. It was made of dull silver, completely alien to the brass and bakelite components of the original device. This was not part of its history. This was an addition, a secret waiting to be found. He stared at the switch, his breath catching in his throat. Every rational instinct, every ounce of his scholarly caution, screamed at him to stop. This machine was a relic from the world of espionage. The switch could be anything: a mechanism to wipe a hidden memory, a self-destruct function, or something far worse. Yet the same inexplicable force that had compelled him to buy the machine now urged him forward. This felt like a moment of destiny, a question posed directly to him across a chasm of 18 years. 18 years of living with the official story. Klaus Richter, his father, the brilliant cryptographer who had betrayed his country. This tiny switch felt like a rebuttal, a silent counterargument to a lifetime of accepted lies. It was a choice between safe ignorance and a dangerous truth. With a hand that trembled slightly, he reached into the cavity. His fingertip rested on the cold, metallic toggle. He took a final, steadying breath, the scent of oil and old electronics filling the quiet air of his study. He flipped the switch. There was no sound, no sudden whirring of gears or dramatic spark. For a long second, nothing happened at all, and a wave of anticlimax washed over him. But then, a low, almost sub-audible hum began to emanate from within the machine's core. And from a minuscule hole drilled discreetly into the side of the casing, a pinprick of light appeared. It was a small, steady, impossible red glow. A light powered by a hidden source, a modern pulse inside an antique heart. It was a signal, reactivated after decades of darkness, a message from a ghost. The red light burned a hole in the dim reality of his study, a single, defiant star in the twilight of the room. Ethan Hayes stood frozen, his hands still hovering over the open cavity in the machine's base. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the profound, humming silence. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and dust, and the world seemed to contract until it consisted of only him, the machine, and that impossible crimson dot. It was a modern light, a 21st century pulse inside a World War II relic, a technological anachronism that defied all logic. It wasn't just on, it was alive, a watchful eye that had suddenly opened after decades of slumber, staring directly at him, demanding an answer to a question he hadn't yet heard. His academic mind, a fortress built on verifiable facts and primary sources, scrambled for a rational explanation. It had to be a clever forgery, a modern replica with a gimmick to entice collectors. Perhaps the flea market vendor had installed it, a cheap parlor trick to inflate the price. But the craftsmanship was too precise, the integration too seamless. The hidden compartment, the switch, the wiring, it was all executed with the meticulous care of a master watchmaker, not a weekend hobbyist. Every logical pathway led to a dead end, leaving him stranded with a single, terrifying conclusion. This modification was original to the machine's secret life, a feature designed by someone who needed it to do more than just encrypt. It was a beacon. The intellectual curiosity quickly dissolved, replaced by a raw, visceral wave of emotion that left him breathless. This wasn't a historical puzzle. It felt like a summons. The machine's silent hum seemed to vibrate with a name he had spent his entire adult life trying to forget. Klaus Richter, his father. The brilliant cryptographer, the Stasi officer, the traitor. The official narrative of his life was a shameful, brittle story that had defined Ethan's own identity in quiet, corrosive ways. For 18 years he had accepted it, building a life of academic detachment as a shield. But this tiny red light felt like a direct contradiction, a ghost from 1986 reaching across time to tap him on the shoulder, whispering that the official story was a lie. He knelt for a closer look, his breath fogging the cool metal casing. The light was unwavering, its intensity perfectly stable, powered by a source he couldn't see but could feel thrumming deep within the Enigma's core. It didn't illuminate anything beyond its own tiny lens, yet it seemed to cast a long, dark shadow over everything he thought he knew. This machine wasn't a random purchase. He understood that now. The pull he had felt at the flea market, the irrational compulsion to own it, was not a whim. It was an echo, a signal he was somehow tuned to receive. This object was a part of his inheritance, a piece of his father that had traveled through the murky channels of history to find him. The Enigma was no longer an inert antique on his desk. It had transformed into a living presence, a silent oracle. The weight of its secrets felt palpable, pressing down on the air in the room. He could almost hear the ghosts of the past whispering through its rotors, the faint, desperate clicks of messages sent into the void. This machine had been a weapon in a war of shadows, and the red light was a sign that the war was not truly over. A battle had been lost, a story had been buried, and this device was the last surviving witness. He felt a profound sense of responsibility settle over him, as heavy as the machine itself. He was no longer just the owner. He was its custodian. He realized with a jolt that the switch had likely initiated a sequence. The light was not the message itself, but an indicator that the machine was ready to deliver one. He looked at the keyboard, the quartz layout suddenly seeming alien and complex. The plug board, with its crisscrossing cables, was a map of incomprehensible logic. His father had understood this language. He had lived and breathed in a world of ciphers and keys, a world where a single misplaced letter could mean the difference between life and death. For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of connection to the man he barely knew, a shared moment of awe and fear before the silent complexity of the machine that sat between them, a bridge across time and death. A promise began to form in the quiet of his study. Unspoken but absolute. He could not turn back. He could not unscrew the base, disable the light, and pretend this never happened. To do so would be the ultimate act of betrayal, not just to his father's memory, but to himself. The shame he had carried for so long was built on a foundation of silence and state-sanctioned lies. This machine offered the chance to demolish that foundation, to replace it with something solid, something true, whatever that truth might be. The red light was a challenge, a dare to look into the abyss of his family's past. It promised answers, but it also promised danger, and he knew he had to accept. The historian in him, the man who dealt in the past, was now facing a history that was not yet fully written. A new and powerful resolve began to solidify within him, displacing the fear. He was not a spy. He was not a cryptographer. He was a professor who preferred the safety of archives to the chaos of the real world. But he was also Klaus Richter's son. And if his father had left a final message locked away inside this mechanical puzzle box, he would find a way to set it free. This was no longer about a historical curiosity. It was about reclaiming a name his own as much as his father's. The investigation had already begun, and he was its sole reluctant agent. A fine sheen of sweat covered his forehead, and he could feel the tremor in his hands, but it was no longer a tremor of fear. It was the electric hum of adrenaline, of purpose. The world outside his study, with its academic deadlines and faculty meetings, seemed distant and insignificant. His real work was here, in this room, with this ghost from Cold War Berlin. He understood that the people who created this secret, the people who hunted his father, who fabricated the story of his treason, were not just figures in a history book. They could still be out there. They would have built new lives on the foundations of old lies, and they would not want the past disturbed. The implications were staggering. If his father was not a traitor, then he was something else. A patriot? A victim? A man silenced before he could expose a truth someone powerful needed to keep buried. The contents of a potential message spun wildly in his mind. It could be a simple farewell, a personal note of regret. Or it could be a key, a piece of intelligence so vital that he had engineered this incredible method to preserve it, hoping that one day it would fall into the right hands. He was beginning to suspect that the right hands had always been meant to be his own. This wasn't an accident. It was a carefully planned, long-delayed inheritance. He stood up, his legs stiff. His gaze was locked on the Enigma machine, on its steady crimson pulse. For 18 years, the official story had been the final word. A case closed, a life condemned, a son left to navigate the wreckage. But a machine built for war and deception was now offering a chance at truth and resolution. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with anticipation. The red light was a question, a final cipher from a dead man. And Ethan Hayes knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would spend the rest of his life, if necessary, finding the answer. The story was not over. Before the Enigma machine shattered the quiet order of his life, Dr. Ethan Hayes existed within a carefully constructed reality. By September 2004, he was a respected history professor at Georgetown University, a man whose world was defined by the scent of aging paper in hushed archives and the predictable cadence of the academic calendar. His suburban D.C. home was a sanctuary of logic, its shelves lined with leather-bound books and primary source documents, each one a testament to a past that could be cataloged, footnoted, and safely contained. He was in his early 40s, a man who had built a fortress of facts and peer-reviewed analysis around himself, not just as a profession, but as a defense. His life was a deliberate act of curation, an attempt to impose scholarly order on the messy, emotional chaos of memory and heritage. This meticulous control extended to his personal life, which was a landscape of polite but profound distance. His colleagues regarded him as brilliant yet aloof, a man more comfortable with dead historical figures than with living colleagues. Friendships were maintained at a safe, intellectual remove, and romantic relationships were fleeting, unable to breach the invisible walls he had erected around his heart. This emotional solitude was not a natural state, but a learned survival tactic. The central lesson of his childhood, absorbed through years of shame and silence, was that personal connections were a liability. He had learned to treat his own history like one of his academic subjects, something to be studied from a distance, analyzed without passion, and never, ever allowed to get too close. The trader's son had learned to trust nothing but verifiable data. The official story, the one that had defined him for 18 years, was brutally simple. On August 12, 1986, his father, Klaus Richter, a genius cryptographer for the German Democratic Republic's infamous Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, walked across a checkpoint into West Berlin for a clandestine meeting and never returned. The state's verdict was swift and unequivocal: defection. Klaus Richter was branded a traitor who had sold out his country, his colleagues, and his family for the promises of the West. This narrative became the cornerstone of Ethan's identity, a public shame that clung to him like a second skin. It was a story sanctioned by a government, recorded in sealed files, and whispered in the hallways of his youth, a truth so absolute it left no room for questions or doubt. For young Ethan and his mother, the fallout was catastrophic. In East Germany, they were instantly transformed into pariahs, the family of an enemy of the state, watched, isolated, and stripped of their dignity. When they were finally permitted to emigrate to the United States a few years later, the geographical distance did little to erase the psychological stain. His mother, a woman broken by the betrayal, rarely spoke Klaus's name. Her silence was a heavy blanket over their new life, suffocating any chance of understanding or healing, and so Ethan learned to bury the past. He shed his German accent, anglicized his name, and dedicated himself to becoming the antithesis of his father, an American academic, a man of transparent facts, not opaque secrets. His past was a locked room, and he had convinced himself he was the one who had thrown away the key. The world around him seemed to conspire in this act of forgetting. Washington, D.C. in 2004 was a city that had moved on. The Cold War was a finished chapter. Its artifacts, pieces of the Berlin Wall, old Soviet medals, sold as novelties to tourists. Germany was a unified, forward-looking nation, a key ally in a new global order. The ideological battle that had defined his father's life and apparent betrayal was now relegated to history textbooks, the very kind Ethan wrote and taught. This prevailing sense of resolution made his own internal turmoil feel all the more isolating. For everyone else, the war was over, the ghosts laid to rest. But for Ethan, the ghost of Klaus Richter still walked, a silent, condemned figure haunting the peaceful, prosperous landscape of a world that had already rendered its verdict and forgotten his name. His own memories of his father were fragmented and unreliable, like faded photographs from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He remembered a quiet, intense man who smelled of pipe tobacco and ink, whose study was a forbidden kingdom of complex charts and humming machines. He recalled his father's hands, long and nimble, effortlessly solving a Rubik's Cube or sketching intricate patterns on a stray napkin while lost in thought. These were the memories of a son, glimpses of a man who was gentle, brilliant, and distant. But these faint personal images were constantly at war with the official portrait of the traitor painted by the Stasi. Was his father the warm presence from his childhood dreams, or the cold, calculating spy from the history books? He had no way of knowing which was real. His choice of profession was no accident. Becoming a historian of the Cold War was a subconscious attempt to gain control over the forces that had shattered his family. In the lecture hall, he could dissect the very mechanisms of the Stasi and the CIA with clinical detachment, transforming his personal trauma into an academic specialty. He could speak of espionage, defection, and betrayal as abstract historical phenomena, positioning himself as the objective analyst rather than the grieving son. This intellectual armor protected him, allowing him to approach the fire that had burned his life without getting consumed by it. It was a brilliant, if lonely, strategy for survival. He had become the world's foremost expert on the prison in which he was still secretly living, a master of its architecture, but unable to find the exit. That Saturday in September began like any other. The week had been a predictable cycle of academic duties, a lecture on the Potsdam Conference, a stack of essays on post-war reconstruction to grade, a tedious department meeting. The weekend stretched before him, a quiet expanse of solitude that was both a comfort and a burden. The silence of his house, usually a welcome reprieve, felt heavy, amplifying his own emptiness. He drove to the Georgetown flea market without a plan or a purpose, simply needing to be among people, to be an anonymous face in a crowd. He was a man adrift, seeking a momentary distraction from the carefully ordered, emotionally sterile life he had built. He was looking for nothing, completely unaware that he was about to find everything. Meanwhile, half a world away in Berlin, Anton Weber moved through his life with the quiet confidence of a man who had not only survived history, but had mastered it. In 2004, he was the esteemed deputy director of the BND, Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, a figure of immense respect and unimpeachable authority. His office offered a panoramic view of the rebuilt Potsdamer Platz, a glittering symbol of the unified nation he had helped to shape. He was charismatic, sharp, and exuded an aura of calm control that put politicians and foreign dignitaries at ease. He was a pillar of the new European order, a man whose past as a loyal Stasi liaison was seen not as a stain, but as proof of his unique ability to bridge the old world and the new. His success was a monument built atop a carefully excavated and refilled grave. In Washington, D.C., Sarah Jenkins was fighting a different kind of war. A freelance journalist in her late 20s, she operated out of a cramped apartment that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and ambition. She was hungry for a story that mattered, a narrative that could cut through the noise of the post-9/11 news cycle. Her current project, a speculative piece on the lingering influence of Cold War intelligence networks, felt like a dead end. She chased down retired CIA analysts and combed through declassified documents, but the trail was always cold, the sources tight-lipped. She was sharp, relentless, and possessed a deep-seated cynicism about official stories, a trait that made her both a brilliant reporter and a frustratingly unsuccessful one. She was looking for a ghost, a crack in the polished facade of accepted history, completely unaware that one was about to find her. The ghost's oldest friend lived in a state of perpetual fear. In a small gray apartment block in the Pankow district of Berlin, Stefan Brandt existed more than he lived. The former cryptographer, once a brilliant colleague of Klaus Richter, was now a stooped elderly man whose world had shrunk to the size of his sparsely furnished rooms. He lived on a meager state pension, his days governed by a rigid routine designed to attract no attention. Every creak in the hallway, every unfamiliar car parked on the street, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through his frail body. For 18 years, he had honored a promise made to his friend, a promise sealed in the terrifying days of 1986. He was the last living witness to Klaus's true work, and the weight of that knowledge was a physical burden, a secret that had kept him a prisoner long after the wall had fallen. Back at Georgetown University, Dr. Evelyn Reed saw the Cold War not through the lens of ideology or trauma, but as a golden age of cryptographic artistry. She was a world-renowned expert in historical ciphers, a woman who could speak of rotor mechanics and plugboard settings with the passion of a poet discussing sonnets. Her office was a chaotic museum of mechanical calculators, cipher wheels, and rare books on cryptanalysis. She was a professional colleague of Ethan's, respecting his work on German history, but finding him emotionally distant. To her, an Enigma machine was the ultimate intellectual puzzle, a beautiful, logical system designed to create chaos. She was a purist, a scientist of secrets, and she was about to be presented with a machine that broke every rule she had ever known, a puzzle that was anything but purely academic. The city of Berlin itself was a character in this silent drama, a place of profound and schizophrenic identity. By 2004, it was a bustling, vibrant metropolis, a magnet for artists and entrepreneurs, a city racing toward the future. Cranes dotted the skyline, and tourists took selfies at the Brandenburg Gate, a symbol of triumphant reunification. Yet, the scars remained. The cobblestones still bore the faint line where the wall had stood. The eerie, abandoned listening station at Teufelsberg loomed over the Grunewald forest, like a forgotten relic, its white domes like hollowed-out eyes. The city's very air was thick with unspoken histories and unresolved fates, a landscape where the past was not truly dead. It was just buried under a thin layer of new concrete, waiting for the slightest tremor to crack the surface and expose the ghosts beneath. Though they were separated by oceans and decades of silence, the lives of these four individuals, the powerful official, the ambitious journalist, the terrified witness, and the grieving son, were inextricably linked by the events of a single day in August 1986. Anton Weber's decorated career was the direct result of Klaus Richter's disappearance. Stefan Brandt's suffocating fear was the price of his survival. Sarah Jenkins' professional ambition was driving her toward the very subject that defined their lives. And Ethan Hayes, the man who had tried the hardest to escape it all, had just unknowingly purchased the key that would unlock their shared, dangerous past. They were all satellites held in a delicate, invisible orbit around a central, unspoken truth, and the gravitational pull was about to become irresistible, threatening to send them all crashing into one another. The prevailing mood of the era was one of historical closure. The Cold War was a closed chapter, a story with a clear beginning, a tense middle, and a triumphant, democratic end. The files were being declassified, the museums were being built, and the world had moved on to new conflicts and new enemies. To question the settled narratives of that time was to be disruptive, to pick at a scar that society had collectively agreed to let heal. This powerful inertia, this deep institutional and cultural desire to leave the past in the past, was the ultimate defense for a man like Anton Weber. He was protected not just by his own power and network, but by a world that no longer had the appetite to listen to ghosts or to question the verdicts that history had already rendered. And so, the pieces were set on the board, each one moving in its own predictable pattern. In Berlin, Anton Weber prepared for a security conference, his mind on the future of global intelligence. In D.C., Sarah Jenkins submitted another article, feeling the familiar sting of professional frustration. In his small apartment, Stefan Brandt drew his curtains as evening fell, the shadows in his room feeling deeper than usual. And in his quiet suburban study, surrounded by the comforting silence of his ordered life, Ethan Hayes ran a cloth over the cool bakelite casing of his new purchase. He was just a historian with a strange antique, a man seeking a fleeting distraction. He had no idea he was holding a declaration of war from a dead man, and that the long, quiet peace of his life was already over. The initial shock that had frozen Ethan in his study began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged clarity. The red light was not the message. It was a signal that a message was waiting. He looked at the Enigma's complex face, the three rotors sitting in their cradle, the alphabet keys staring up at him, the spaghetti-like tangle of cables on the plugboard. It was a language he did not speak, a logic he could not comprehend. A profound sense of inadequacy washed over him. He was a historian, a man who interpreted the past from a safe distance, reading letters and analyzing documents. This machine demanded a different skill set. It demanded the mind of a cryptographer, the mind of his father. He felt the immense pressure of the moment, the chilling possibility that his father's last words were locked inside this box, and he lacked the key to set them free. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not do this alone. There was only one person in his professional circle who could navigate this labyrinth of wires and rotors. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a colleague in the university's mathematics department, was a world-renowned expert in historical ciphers. Her fascination with the Enigma was legendary on campus. Making the decision was instantaneous, but the execution was fraught with risk. He carefully wrapped the heavy machine in a thick blanket, placing it in a sturdy canvas bag. The weight felt dangerous, illicit. As he drove the short distance to Georgetown University, his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He was smuggling a piece of Cold War espionage history onto campus, an artifact that had been illegally modified for purposes he could only guess at. The academic caution that had governed his entire life was dissolving in a wave of desperate necessity. Evelyn Reed's office was exactly as he remembered it, a chaotic wonderland of intellectual history, crammed with cipher wheels, slide rules, and teetering stacks of books on cryptanalysis. She greeted him with her usual distracted warmth, her eyes sharp and curious. When Ethan unwrapped the Enigma and placed it on her cluttered desk, her professional interest was immediately piqued. A three-rotor Wehrmacht model, in beautiful condition, she murmured, her fingers tracing its contours. But when Ethan showed her the hidden compartment, the modern switch, and the impossible red light glowing steadily from its core, her academic fascination morphed into stunned disbelief. She leaned in closer, her expression shifting from curiosity to intense, focused awe. "My God, Ethan," she whispered, looking up at him. "What is this? This isn't in any of the literature. This machine is wrong." Her initial shock quickly gave way to rigorous, methodical analysis. For the next hour, she became a forensic scientist of history, examining the modification with a jeweler's loupe and a set of delicate probes. Her verdict was swift and chilling. The craftsmanship was impeccable. The integration of the modern components into the 1940s chassis was seamless. She identified the power source as a specialized, long-life lithium battery, likely military grade from the mid-1980s. "This wasn't done in a garage," she concluded, her voice low and serious. "The precision is extraordinary. This was a professional job, done by someone with access to sophisticated technology and a deep understanding of the Enigma's architecture. This wasn't just modified, Ethan. It was upgraded. It was given a second, secret life." The factual confirmation sent a shiver through him. This was no collector's gimmick. It was a weapon. The central problem remained: how to unlock it. The standard Enigma operating procedure required a daily key sheet detailing the specific rotor order, ring settings, and plugboard connections. Without it, the number of possible combinations was astronomical, rendering any message mathematically secure. The red light indicated a hidden protocol, but it offered no clues as to how to activate it. For 2 days they worked in the cloistered silence of her lab, the rhythmic click of the Enigma's keys, the only sound breaking the tension. Ethan felt a mounting frustration, a gnawing sense that the answer was hidden in plain sight, a puzzle designed by his father specifically for him to solve. The ghost of Klaus Richter felt closer than ever, a silent presence challenging him to bridge the gap between history and memory, to think not like a scholar, but like a son. The breakthrough came not from a complex algorithm, but from a fragment of a memory. Exhausted and close to giving up, Evelyn began asking Ethan about his father on a more personal level. She searched for habits, quirks, anything that could have been used as a cryptographic key. Digging deep into his past, Ethan recalled a specific, recurring detail from his childhood. His father had taught him to play chess, and had always emphasized the importance of memorable dates. He remembered a specific date circled on every calendar in their home. August 13th, the birthday of the grandfather Ethan had never met. It felt insignificant, a stray piece of personal trivia. But on a desperate hunch, Evelyn converted the date of his disappearance, August 12, 1986, into a numerical sequence, the 12th of August 86, and used it to set the rotors and plugboard. It was a shot in the dark, a key forged from grief and a half-forgotten memory. With the new settings configured, a tense silence fell over the lab. Evelyn took a deep breath and began typing a random string of letters into the keyboard. With each press, a key on the lampboard above flashed, illuminating a different letter. Ethan watched, his heart pounding. At first, the output seemed like gibberish. But then, a pattern emerged. It was not random. It was structured text. It was working. The machine, dormant for 18 years, was speaking. A powerful, overwhelming wave of emotion washed over Ethan. His father had left him a key, not made of metal, but of a shared memory, a trust that he would one day remember the significance of that final, fateful day. In that moment, the cold, mechanical object on the table became a conduit, a warm, living connection to the father he thought he had lost forever. Evelyn's hands moved with practiced speed, transcribing the letters as they appeared. Inside the hidden compartment, they had found a small metal plate with a short sequence of characters, faintly etched into its surface, the encrypted message itself. She carefully typed each character, and the machine translated. Letter by agonizing letter, the final words of Klaus Richter materialized on her notepad. The message was brutally short, stripped of all emotion, and it shattered the silence of the room. Lynx is double, selling Phoenix Network. Dead drop at TEUFELSBERG. They are hunting me. Klaus. The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. The flea market antique was gone. In its place sat a piece of evidence, a warning from the grave, and a testament that his father was not a traitor. He was a man who had been silenced, The decoded words lay on Evelyn's notepad, a stark, typewritten ghost in the quiet university lab. For Ethan, they were not just letters, they were a resurrection, Lynx's double. "They are hunting me." Each phrase was a chisel, chipping away at the 18-year-old monument of lies he had been forced to live under. The sterile scent of the laboratory was suddenly replaced by the phantom smell of his father's pipe tobacco, a sensory memory so sharp it made him flinch. He wasn't a traitor. The official story, the source of a lifetime of quiet shame, was a fabrication designed to cover a murder. A wave of vindication washed over him, hot and fierce, followed by an icy dread. His father had been silenced for this knowledge, and now that knowledge belonged to him. The Enigma machine on the table hummed almost imperceptibly, no longer an antique but a loaded weapon. Evelyn, ever the pragmatist, brought him back from the emotional precipice. She pointed a pen at the notepad, her voice a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. "Let's break this down," she said, her tone clinical. "We have 4 distinct pieces of intelligence. 1. Lynx, a code name for a double agent. 2. Phoenix Network, the asset being sold, likely a network of agents whose identities were compromised. 3. Teufelsberg, a specific location for a dead drop. This is our only physical lead. 4. A confirmation of motive. Klaus wasn't defecting. He was being hunted." Her analysis was cold and precise, transforming his father's desperate final testament into a set of actionable clues. The message was a map, and for the first time, Ethan had a direction, a path leading directly into the heart of the conspiracy that had consumed his father's life. The immediate question hung heavy in the air between them: what now? They were 2 academics in possession of a secret that had been buried for nearly 2 decades, a secret powerful people had killed to protect. Taking this to the authorities was a gamble they couldn't afford. Who could they trust? The Stasi was gone, but its agents and networks had simply melted back into society. The CIA, the likely buyer of the Phoenix Network, would have no interest in dredging up a successful Cold War operation. The Lynx, whoever he was, had gotten away with it. He could be anyone now. A politician, a respected businessman, perhaps even a senior intelligence official in the new unified Germany. They were standing on the edge of a minefield, and every step had to be taken with absolute care, knowing the ghosts of 1986 were still watching. They needed help, but not from the inside. They needed an outsider, someone with the skills to navigate this world of shadows, but with no allegiance to the institutions that built it. Ethan's mind raced through his professional contacts before landing on a more obscure name, Sarah Jenkins. He had read a series of her articles a year prior, a deep dive into the lingering influence of Stasi informants in modern German politics. She was a freelance journalist, which meant she was hungry and untethered to a major corporate agenda. Her writing was relentless, bordering on obsessive, and she displayed a healthy, profound distrust of official narratives. It was a long shot, contacting a complete stranger with a story that sounded like a spy novel, but Ethan knew he and Evelyn couldn't do this alone. They were historians and scientists. They needed a hunter. Their meeting took place in a noisy DuPont Circle coffee shop, the mundane setting a stark contrast to the gravity of their conversation. Sarah Jenkins was younger than Ethan had expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She listened with a practiced, almost unnerving stillness as Ethan laid out the initial story, the flea market, the unusual machine, the academic curiosity. Her skepticism was palpable, a professional shield forged from years of chasing down dead-end leads and listening to conspiracy theorists. Ethan could see her mentally categorizing him, filing him away as another grieving son with a wild story. He knew he had to give her something concrete, something that would break through that shield and show her the chilling, verifiable truth that lay beneath his quiet, academic exterior. He needed to show her the ghost. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. On it were the transcribed words from the Enigma. My colleague, Dr. Reed, has cryptographically verified the machine and the message's authenticity. he said, his voice low. The modification was made in the mid-1980s. Sarah unfolded the paper. Her eyes scanned the short, brutal sentences. The ambient noise of the coffee shop seemed to fade away. Her expression shifted, the professional skepticism dissolving into a raw, electric focus. This wasn't a rambling theory. It was a primary source document from a dead man. Phoenix Network, she whispered, her journalistic instincts firing on all cylinders. Teufelsberg. She looked up at Ethan, her gaze intense. If this is real, she said, the thrill of the chase in her voice. This isn't just a story. This is history. And it's not over. In that moment, an unlikely alliance was forged. The grieving son, the brilliant scientist, and the hungry journalist. Each of them held a piece of the puzzle. Ethan had the personal connection and the key, the enigma itself. Evelyn had the technical expertise to validate their findings and decipher any further cryptographic clues. Sarah had the investigative tools and the relentless drive to chase the truth through the labyrinth of archives and uncooperative sources. Their first plan was simple and direct. Ethan would prepare to travel to Berlin, to the ruins of Teufelsberg, to search for the dead drop his father had mentioned. Meanwhile, Sarah would start digging from Washington, leveraging her network of sources and her access to declassified databases, searching for any official or unofficial mention of the two key phrases, links, and Phoenix Network. The hunt had officially begun. That evening, Sarah made her first call. Her contact was a retired CIA archivist, a man she had occasionally used for deep background on Cold War operations. She kept her tone casual, burying the query in a list of other questions. By the way, she said, ever come across something called the Phoenix Network in your time? Stasi-related, probably mid-80s. The line went silent. Not a thoughtful pause, but a heavy, dead-air silence that felt charged with electricity. After a long moment, the archivist's voice returned, low and stripped of its earlier warmth. Listen to me, he said, his words clipped and cold. I never heard you ask that question. And you need to forget you ever heard that name. Some things are meant to stay buried. Before Sarah could respond, the line clicked dead. They had their first answer. This wasn't a forgotten piece of history. It was a secret still being actively protected. The dead-end call with the retired CIA archivist left Sarah Jenkins staring at her phone, the dial tone buzzing like an angry insect in the quiet of her apartment. The man's voice, which had started as a warm, nostalgic drawl, had turned to ice the moment she uttered the words, Phoenix Network. It wasn't a denial. It was a threat wrapped in a warning. Forget you ever heard that name. This was the reaction she had secretly hoped for and openly dreaded. It was the visceral confirmation that this wasn't some forgotten piece of Cold War trivia. It was a live wire, an unexploded ordnance still buried just beneath the surface of official history. She immediately called Ethan. The hunt for his father's ghost had just become terrifyingly real. They had disturbed a grave that powerful people still had a vested interest in keeping sealed, and the guardians of that secret were now awake and listening. As he packed a small suitcase for Berlin, Ethan felt the crushing weight of his own history settling back onto his shoulders. It had been years since he had returned to the city of his birth, the place where his life had fractured into a before and an after. Each item he folded, a sweater, a pair of slacks, felt like a preparation for a journey into his own haunted past. The Enigma machine, the key to this entire ordeal, would remain safely with Evelyn in a secure university vault, a silent oracle guarded in Washington. But its message was seared into his mind, a cryptic compass pointing him back toward the source of his trauma. He was no longer a historian studying the Cold War from a safe academic distance. He was an active participant, walking the same shadowed streets his father had walked in his final, desperate hours, heading toward a truth he both desperately needed and profoundly feared. Their arrival at Berlin's Tegel Airport was a study in contrasts. The city that greeted them was vibrant, modern, and pulsing with the energy of a unified future, a stark departure from the gray, divided landscape of Ethan's memories. He and Sarah checked into a small, unassuming hotel in Mitte, the former eastern sector, where the clash of old and new was most palpable. Gleaming glass towers stood beside drab, Soviet-era apartment blocks, a physical manifestation of the city's schizophrenic identity. While Sarah, ever the journalist, spread maps across the hotel bed and formulated a methodical plan of attack, Ethan found himself adrift in a sea of ghosts. Every street corner, every U-Bahn station, every lingering scent of coal smoke on the autumn air was a trigger, pulling him back to a childhood that had been stolen from him right here in this very city. Their first objective was Teufelsberg, the Devil's Mountain. The drive through the lush Grunewald forest ended at the base of the man-made hill, and the ascent on foot felt like a pilgrimage to a forgotten temple. The abandoned U.S. listening station stood silhouetted against the gray sky, its white geodesic domes ripped and tattered, looking like giant, hollowed-out skulls. Inside, the decay was absolute. The rooms were covered in layers of graffiti, the floors littered with broken glass and debris. It felt like a fool's errand, searching for a tiny clue left 18 years ago in a place that had been so thoroughly reclaimed by time and vandalism. A cold despair began to creep into Ethan's heart. His father's last trail, his only physical lead, seemed to have been erased completely, leaving them standing in the ruins of a dead and silent history. Just as they were about to concede defeat, Sarah's sharp journalistic eye caught what Ethan's grief-clouded gaze had missed. At the base of a rusted antenna mount, half hidden by weeds and graffiti, was a small, deliberately etched symbol. It was no bigger than a thumbnail, a simple circle with a single vertical line cutting through it. To Ethan, it looked like just another random scratch in the metal. But Sarah recognized it instantly from her research into Cold War espionage tradecraft. It was a variation of a chalk mark, a discrete sign used by agents to confirm a location or signal that a dead drop had been cleared or compromised. Klaus hadn't left the package here. He had left a signpost. The dead drop was somewhere else, but his father had been here. The trail wasn't cold. It had just taken a sharp, unexpected turn. The cryptic symbol from Teufelsberg gave them a new, more concrete direction: the Stasi Records Agency. Armed with Ethan's legal right as a direct relative, they formally requested access to Klaus Richter's official file. After days of navigating a labyrinth of German bureaucracy, they were finally led into a sterile, climate-controlled room and presented with a thick, heavy file. It was a meticulously crafted narrative of betrayal. Page after page contained surveillance reports, informant testimonies, and cold psychological assessments, all painting a seamless portrait of an unstable, ideologically weak man who was being blackmailed by the CIA. The file concluded that on August 12, 1986, he had fled with state secrets. It was a perfect, self-contained story, a legal and historical document that left no room for doubt. It was the official truth, stamped and certified. That night, the hotel room became their war room. They spread the photocopied pages of the Stasi file across one side of the bed and placed a single sheet of paper with the Enigma's decoded message on the other. The two realities lay side by side, in violent, irreconcilable opposition. On one side was the state-sanctioned story of a traitor, detailed and clinically plausible. On the other was a father's desperate, last-gasp warning: "Lynxes double. They are hunting me." The stark contradiction was chilling. This wasn't a case of conflicting reports or historical ambiguity. This was evidence of a deliberate, sophisticated cover-up. The file wasn't a record of events. It was the weapon used to conceal a murder, and it had been forged by the very institution his father had served. The conspiracy wasn't a theory. It was right here, in black and white. They knew their next move had to be human. Documents could be forged, but memories, however fated or feared, held a different kind of truth. Their investigation turned to tracking down the surviving members of his father's old cryptography unit, Section 12 of the Stasi. The list of names was short. Most were dead, had disappeared after the wall fell or simply refused to speak, their voices thick with a fear that had outlasted the regime they served. But one name stood out: Stefan Brandt. The records indicated he had taken an abrupt early retirement for health reasons just weeks after Klaus vanished. They found him living in a small, gray apartment block in Pankow, a district that still felt like a preserved relic of the German Democratic Republic, a man hiding in plain sight. Stefan Brandt was a ghost, living in a tomb of his own making. When he opened the door, he was a stooped, frail man with eyes that held the hunted look of someone who had been expecting a knock like this for 18 years. He listened to their introduction with a stony face, denying everything, his hand already moving to slam the door shut. But as the door began to close, Ethan spoke, his voice low and steady. "Klaus Richter sent me." The name was a key, unlocking a flicker of something deep behind the old man's terrified gaze. Fear warred with a ghost of loyalty from a lifetime ago. He didn't let them in, but he didn't shut the door completely either, leaving it cracked just enough to show that a part of him, buried deep, wanted the truth to finally see the light. While Ethan and Sarah were chipping away at the wall of silence in Berlin, the conflict escalated dramatically back in Washington. An urgent, panicked phone call came from Dr. Evelyn Reed. Her university laboratory had been broken into the previous night. The campus police were baffled. Nothing of value was taken. Expensive computers, oscilloscopes, and sensitive research equipment were all left untouched. The only thing that had been disturbed was her desk, the drawers rifled through, papers scattered. The Enigma machine itself was safe. On a hunch, she had moved it to a high-security university vault just days before. But the message was brutally, terrifyingly clear. Someone knew they had the machine. The Lynx wasn't a historical figure. He was an active threat, and his network had just reached across the Atlantic. The news of the break-in landed like a grenade in their Berlin hotel room, instantly vaporizing any remaining sense of academic detachment. They were no longer historians chasing a cold case. They were targets in a very hot one. The invisible enemy they were hunting was now hunting them in return. The Lynx, the man his father had tried to expose, was clearly still powerful, with a network capable of monitoring them and acting with impunity. Every quiet source they contacted, every official file they requested, must have been a tripwire, alerting him that the past was being disturbed. A new, desperate urgency fueled their actions. They raced back to Stefan Brandt's apartment in Pankow. This time, they weren't just asking for his help. They were there to warn him that the monster he had been hiding from for 18 years was stirring again, and his fragile sanctuary was about to be blown apart. The frantic pounding on Stefan Brandt's door was not a request, but an alarm. When the old man opened it a crack, his face a mask of weary terror, he was met not with the patient questions of a historian, but with the raw urgency of a fellow target. "They know," Ethan said, his voice low and strained, foregoing any preamble. "They broke into my colleague's lab in Washington. They were looking for the machine." He let the words sink in, watching the last vestiges of color drain from Stefan's face. Sarah stood beside him, her expression grim. "Your silence isn't protecting you," she added, her tone sharp but not unkind. "It's just leaving you isolated. Whoever they are, their reach is global. They are cleaning house, and you are a loose end." The fragile, self-imposed prison of Stefan's apartment suddenly felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb, its walls offering no protection from a ghost that could cross oceans. For a long moment, Stefan stood frozen in the doorway, the chain lock, the only thing separating his suffocating past from a terrifying present. The news of a break-in, so far away in America, was the final brutal confirmation of a fear he had lived with for 18 years. That the monster he had helped create was not bound by time or geography. The quiet, anonymous life he had so carefully curated was an illusion, a fragile pane of glass that had just been shattered. With a trembling hand and a soft, rattling sigh of defeat, he unlatched the chain. The door swung inward, revealing the dim, sparsely furnished interior of his apartment. It was a silent, profound surrender. He was no longer just a witness to history. He was a participant in its violent, unfinished final chapter. He stepped back, allowing them to enter the sanctuary that had just become a trap, the weight of his long-held secret finally too heavy to bear alone. The air inside was stale and thick, with the scent of old paper and fear, a place where time had seemingly stopped in 1989. As Stefan slowly shuffled toward a small, threadbare armchair, he began to speak, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, as if unused for years. He started not with the conspiracy, but with the man. "You must understand who your father was," he began, looking directly at Ethan. Klaus was more than a cryptographer. He was the Stasi's conscience, the one man who believed the system could be protected from its own corruption. He was our best ghost hunter, the head of a small, unsanctioned internal affairs unit, tasked with finding threats from within. He didn't just solve ciphers, Dr. Hayes. He hunted the men who wrote them, the ones who betrayed the very secrets they were sworn to protect. He was the guardian of the guardians, a dangerous job in a world built on paranoia. He paused, gathering his strength before uttering the name that had haunted his every waking moment. "The Phoenix Network," he whispered, "was not a list of agents to be sold, as your father's message might suggest. It was the opposite. It was Klaus's masterpiece, a brilliant trap. He had discovered a catastrophic breach, a steady hemorrhage of our most valuable assets in the West. He suspected a high-level mole was selling identities to the CIA. So he created the Phoenix Network, a completely fabricated network of phantom agents, complete with false identities, legends, and communication protocols. He fed information about this fictitious network into a very small, select circle of senior officers. The plan was simple. Whichever of those phantom identities turned up in CIA chatter would lead him directly back to the source of the leak, to the traitor at the heart of the ministry." Ethan leaned forward, his hands clenched into fists. "And did it work? Did he find him?" Stefan nodded slowly, his eyes closing as if recalling a nightmare. "Yes. The bait was taken almost immediately. A phantom agent, codenamed Icarus, was compromised. The leak could only have come from one of three men. Klaus investigated them all, but his focus quickly narrowed to one, a brilliant, charming, and ruthlessly ambitious liaison officer, a man who was untouchable, protected by powerful figures at the very top. Klaus's private codename for him, the one he used only with me, was The Lynx, his real name. His name is Anton Weber. The name, spoken aloud for the first time in nearly 2 decades, hung in the small room like a death sentence, a tangible evil that had finally been given a face. The summer of 1986, Stefan recounted, was a season of suffocating dread. Klaus knew he had his man, but he was trapped. Anton Weber was a master of political maneuvering, a protege of the most feared men in the Stasi. To accuse him without ironclad, irrefutable proof would be professional suicide, and likely a literal one. Klaus began to feel the net tightening around him. His requests for surveillance on Weber were mysteriously denied or delayed. His trusted contacts within the ministry suddenly grew distant, their eyes filled with a new, cold fear. He was being isolated, his own methods turned against him. The ghost hunter had become the hunted. He told Stefan that he felt Weber watching him, that every conversation felt like an interrogation, every shadow in the hallway a potential assassin. He was a man racing to expose a conspiracy before it could swallow him whole, utterly alone in a system he had sworn to protect. It was during these final, desperate weeks that Klaus turned to his old passion, historical cryptography. "He showed me the enigma," Stefan said, his gaze distant. He called it his ghost machine, his last will and testament. He knew all official channels were compromised, monitored by Weber or his allies. The machine was his only hope for an off-network, untraceable communication line. It was a brilliant anachronism. No one in 1986 would be looking for a message hidden in a World War II cipher. He had engineered it as a failsafe, a way to transmit his final report, the complete evidence against Weber, to the one man he still trusted, a high-ranking official in the army. He was supposed to pass the machine to a contact in West Berlin on that final day, but he never made it to the meeting. Weber must have gotten to him first. Teufelsberg. Ethan pressed, his voice urgent. What about the dead drop? Stefan shook his head, a flicker of Klaus's cunning shining in his tired eyes. That was a misdirection, a final piece of spycraft. Klaus knew he might be followed. Teufelsberg was just a signal point, a place to leave a sign that the real package was ready. The actual evidence, a single canister of microfilm containing copies of documents, recordings, everything needed to expose Weber, is hidden somewhere else. He told me that if anything happened to him, the proof would be in a place only family would understand, a location from his life before the ministry, before the man he was forced to become. He looked at Ethan, his expression conveying the immense weight of the task ahead. He left the final key with you, his son. He trusted that you would one day come looking for it, that you would understand. Just as the weight of this revelation settled over them, a sharp electronic buzz cut through the heavy silence of the room. Sarah pulled her phone from her pocket, her brow furrowed in confusion at the notification for a new email from an unknown, encrypted address. She opened it. Her face went pale, her professional composure instantly dissolving into a mask of pure shock. Without a word, she turned the screen toward Ethan. The image was crystal clear, a high-resolution photograph taken from a significant distance. It showed the two of them, Ethan and Sarah, sitting at the small outdoor table at the DuPont Circle coffee shop in Washington, D.C., deep in conversation. It had been taken days ago, an ocean away. Beneath the image was a single, chilling line of text. Stop digging. The message was unequivocal. The lynx was not just a ghost from the past. He was here, now, and he had been watching them from the very beginning. The photograph was a declaration of war. It was proof that Anton Weber's network was not a dusty relic of the Cold War, but a sophisticated, modern, and terrifyingly efficient intelligence operation with global reach. They had assumed they were the hunters, quietly tracking the faint trail of a decades-old crime. The reality was a horrifying inversion. They were the prey, and the predator had been patiently observing their every move, from the archives in Berlin to a coffee shop in Washington. Every request for a file, every interview with a source, every step they took had been a tripwire, alerting Weber that his carefully constructed world was under threat. They were not fighting a memory. They were fighting a man who held a position of immense power in the present day, a man who had access to the full, terrifying arsenal of a state intelligence agency. The small, stuffy apartment in Pankow, once a potential sanctuary of truth, now felt like the epicenter of a trap that was closing in around them. They were three people armed with a dead man's story against a powerful government official who had already killed once to protect his secret. The stakes had escalated beyond anything they could have imagined. This was no longer about clearing a name or uncovering a historical injustice. It had become a desperate, real-time battle for survival. Stefan Brandt, who had spent 18 years successfully hiding from his past, now looked at Ethan. His eyes filled with a terrifying clarity, the fear of a man who knew exactly what their enemy was capable of. He murdered your father and erased him from history to protect this secret, he whispered, his voice trembling with a new, immediate terror. Do you truly understand what he will be willing to do to you? The photograph on the screen was a violation, a digital ghost that had crossed an ocean to mock them in the dim, stale air of Stefan's apartment. It wasn't just an image, it was a statement of absolute power. The casual intimacy of the coffee shop scene, the angle of Ethan's head as he leaned in, the focused intensity on Sarah's face, was captured with the cold precision of a sniper's scope. The world outside the frame, the bustling D.C. street, was rendered irrelevant, a meaningless backdrop to their isolated, targeted reality. The message, "Stop digging," was almost redundant. The image itself was the true threat, a silent, chilling promise that there was no distance, no anonymity, no safe harbor left for them anywhere in the world. The walls of the small room seemed to press in, the air growing thin and heavy, each breath a conscious effort against the suffocating weight of an invisible, omnipresent enemy. Stefan Brandt made a sound, a choked, guttural gasp that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. For 18 years, He had lived a life of meticulous, suffocating caution, a prisoner of a fear that had become his only companion. Now that fear had a face, a digital signature, and it had found him in his final refuge. He stumbled back, his frail body colliding with a small table, sending a stack of old newspapers scattering across the floor like dead leaves. "You see?" he rasped, his voice a ragged whisper, his eyes wide with a terror that was ancient and immediate. "This is what he does. He doesn't just watch, he erases. He makes people disappear from their own lives. You have to stop! You have to leave Berlin, go home, and burn that machine. Forget my name. Forget Klaus. Before he makes you forget everything." His panic was a contagion, a palpable force that filled the room with the raw, animal terror of a cornered man. But as Ethan looked at the old man's trembling form and the stark, chilling photograph on Sarah's phone, something inside him shifted. The fear was there, cold and sharp in his gut, but it was being consumed by a different fire, a cold, clarifying rage he hadn't felt in his entire life. He had spent his adulthood in a state of quiet, academic retreat, building walls of logic and distance to protect himself from the shame of his father's supposed betrayal. He had accepted the official lie. He had allowed a murderer to define his family's legacy. This threat, this arrogant display of power from the man who had orphaned him, was not a deterrent. It was a catalyst. It was the final, brutal piece of evidence he needed. He was no longer a grieving son seeking answers. He was a man with a target, and the ghost he was hunting was no longer his father's, but Anton Weber's. "A place only family would understand," Ethan repeated, the words cutting through the noise of his own anger. Stefan's desperate plea had unintentionally handed him the key. He had been approaching this like a historian, analyzing clues, following a paper trail, looking for spycraft. But his father's final message wasn't for a spy or a historian. It was for a son. He closed his eyes, shutting out the fearful present, and deliberately stepped into the one place he had spent a lifetime avoiding, the unfiltered, emotional landscape of his childhood. He pushed past the shadows of 1986, past the gray, oppressive years of the regime, searching for the before. He wasn't looking for a fact. He was searching for a feeling, a scent, a sound that existed before the world had been poisoned by lies. He was excavating his own heart, looking for a memory his father had buried there like a time capsule. A fragment surfaced, sharp and vivid, a sensory ghost from a forgotten world, the rich, comforting scent of his mother's sauerbraten roasting in the oven. The faint, melodic notes of a Bach cello suite, the one his father would play on the record player in his study on quiet Sunday afternoons. And the distinct, tactile sensation of worn, cracked leather. He was a small boy, sitting in his father's lap in a massive armchair. His father wasn't a cryptographer in that moment. He was just a man who loved books. He could feel the weight of a heavy, leather-bound volume in his small hands, could smell the sweet, dusty scent of its aging pages. It was a game, their secret. "Every book has a story on its pages," his father had whispered to him, his voice a low, warm rumble. "But the most important ones have secrets hidden inside." The image sharpened, coming into focus with the stunning clarity of a rediscovered dream. His father was showing him a hollowed-out book, its center pages meticulously carved away to create a small, hidden compartment. It was where he kept family treasures, his grandfather's Iron Cross from the First War, his mother's baptismal certificate. A place of pure sentiment, completely divorced from the cold, dangerous world of his real work. And the book itself, it was a specific, beloved volume. A first edition of Goethe's Faust, the story of a man who makes a deal with the devil. The symbolism was so painfully obvious now. His father, the brilliant man who had made a deal with a devilish state, had hidden his final truth, his soul, inside that very story. It was the perfect, poetic cipher, a message hidden not in code, but in love. Then came the second, crucial piece of the memory. The armchair, the library, the book, They weren't from the house he remembered leaving in 1986. They were from a different time, a different place. Their first apartment, a small, cramped flat in a drab Pankow building they had moved out of when he was only 8 years old, long before his father's work became so dangerous and secretive. A profound, bone-deep certainty settled over him. The microfilm wasn't in a bank vault or a clandestine dead drop. It was in the one place no one in the world of espionage would ever think to look. It was in a hollowed-out book, likely left behind with other unwanted things, in a dusty, forgotten corner of a building tied only to family, innocence, and a life before the Stasi. It was a ghost, hiding in the ruins of a home. The revelation electrified the room, instantly vaporizing the paralysis of fear. "I know where it is," Ethan said, his voice quiet but charged with an absolute conviction that left no room for doubt. The hunt was on again, but the nature of it had changed. It was no longer a methodical investigation. It was a frantic, desperate race against a ticking clock. The photograph was a warning shot. They knew Weber would not warn them twice. The next move would be to neutralize the threat permanently. They had a window, perhaps only hours, to get to that apartment building, find the book, and retrieve the evidence before Weber's invisible network, which had proven its terrifying reach, closed the net around them completely. The stale air in the apartment now crackled with a new, desperate energy, the adrenaline of a final, do-or-die gambit. Their drive through the rain-slick streets of East Berlin was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Streetlights smeared across the wet windshield, illuminating the familiar, monolithic Soviet-era apartment blocks that loomed out of the darkness like ancient, gray tombstones. Ethan navigated from memory, a mental map of his childhood, guiding them through the maze of streets he hadn't seen in over 30 years. He was silent, lost in the slipstream of time, while Sarah drove with a focused intensity, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of a tail. The rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers was a metronome counting down their final, precious minutes of freedom. Every passing shadow, every pair of headlights behind them felt like the approaching presence of the lynx, a predator closing in on its cornered prey. The apartment building stood exactly as he remembered it, a monument to the gray, oppressive permanence of the old regime. The air in the lobby was thick, with the institutional scent of boiled cabbage and damp concrete, a smell so specific and evocative it was like inhaling a memory. A sleepy-eyed concierge eyed them with suspicion from behind a plexiglass barrier, but Sarah, with a fabricated story about visiting a sick aunt and a flash of a fake press pass, managed to charm and distract him just long enough for them to slip past and head not up the stairs but down, toward the building's cavernous, echoing basement. Each step down the cold, concrete stairs felt like a descent into the past, into the very foundations of the life that had been stolen from him. The air grew colder, damper, smelling of earth and decay. The cellar was a subterranean labyrinth, a maze of narrow corridors lined with wire mesh storage cages, each one a small private tomb for the forgotten artifacts of countless lives. The dim, bare bulbs overhead cast long, distorted shadows, and the only sound was the drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the darkness. They found the cage assigned to their old apartment number, its door secured by a simple, rusted padlock that looked as old as the building itself. With a loud, metallic snap that echoed through the silent basement, the bolt cutters Sarah had brought severed the lock. The wire door creaked open, revealing a dark, cramped space filled with the debris of a life abandoned decades ago. A child's tricycle with a single rusted wheel, a box of yellowed vinyl records, and a small, wooden crate filled with old, moldering books. A thick cloud of dust billowed out as Ethan pulled the crate into the dim light of the corridor. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat in the profound, subterranean silence. His hands, trembling slightly, sifted through the decaying paper, the musty, sweet smell of mold filling his nostrils. The books were damp to the touch, their pages warped and stained. For a terrifying moment, he thought they were too late, that time and neglect had destroyed the very thing they had come for. He felt a wave of despair, the crushing weight of a final, definitive failure. His father's last gambit, his one hope for vindication, had been consumed by the simple, indifferent decay of the years. The trail had gone cold, right here, at its very end, in this damp and forgotten tomb. Then his fingers brushed against it, a binding that felt different. Solid, familiar, its leather still supple beneath the grime. He pulled it from the crate, Goethe's Faust. Even in the dim light, he could see the elegant gold leaf on the spine, faded but intact. It felt unnaturally heavy, its weight, a dense, solid promise. With breath held and fingers coated in decades of dust, he opened the cover. The first few pages were intact, but the center of the book was a perfect, hollowed-out rectangle, the cut edges of the paper as precise as a surgeon's incision. And there, nestled in the heart of the ancient text, wrapped in a small, tight bundle of oilcloth, was a single, cold, metallic canister of microfilm. He lifted it out. It was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, but he could feel the immense, explosive weight of the truth it contained. The ghost had finally spoken. The weight of the small metal canister in Ethan's hand was immense, a dense, physical anchor to a history that had, until this moment, been nothing but smoke and whispers. In the damp, subterranean silence of the Berlin cellar, the truth felt both explosive and profoundly intimate. He looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the weak glow of her phone, her expression a mixture of triumph and acute tension. They had it. The proof, the weapon, the final words of a ghost who had waited 18 years to be heard. But this victory was fragile, a single flickering candle in a vast, encroaching darkness. They were deep in enemy territory, in a city still haunted by the networks Anton Weber had once commanded, and every second they remained here, the net they had only just escaped was being drawn tighter around them, its steel threads guided by a man who would stop at nothing to bury this truth alongside them. Their ascent from the basement was a frantic, heart-pounding climb back into a world of immediate danger. Every creak of the old concrete stairs, every distant sound from the street above, echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence. They moved with a desperate urgency, the microfilm canister clutched tightly in Ethan's pocket, a cold, hard reminder of the stakes. Outside, the rain had subsided, leaving the Berlin streets slick and reflective under the jaundiced glow of the streetlights. Sarah drove with a focused, almost feral intensity, her eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, analyzing every pair of headlights, every vehicle that lingered too long behind them. The city, which had felt like a landscape of personal memory just hours before, had transformed into a hostile maze, a hunting ground, where they were the designated prey, and the hunter knew every alley, every shadow, every escape route. They found refuge in a small, anonymous hotel near the industrial outskirts of the city, a place of transient lives and no questions asked. In the sterile, impersonal room, the reality of their situation began to set in. They possessed a truth powerful enough to dismantle one of the most respected figures in modern German intelligence, but they were utterly isolated, with no allies and no safe harbor. Sarah, leveraging a network of contacts built on years of careful, often paranoid, journalism, managed to secure a portable microfilm reader from a sympathetic archivist. That night, against the blank, peeling paint of the hotel room wall, they projected the images. The ghost of Klaus Richter finally spoke, not in whispers, but in the cold, irrefutable language of evidence. The flickering light illuminated the stark, black-and-white documents, the grainy surveillance photos, and the meticulously kept ledgers of a dead man. The contents of the microfilm were a masterpiece of counterintelligence, a complete and devastating indictment of Anton Weber. Klaus Richter had not just suspected his colleague, he had methodically built a fortress of evidence against him. The film contained copies of classified Stasi documents that Weber had accessed without authorization, cross-referenced with records of secret financial transactions from offshore accounts. There were surveillance photographs of Weber meeting with a known CIA handler in a Vienna coffee shop, and a detailed handwritten log by Klaus that chronicled every lie, every inconsistency, every act of sabotage committed by the man codenamed Lynx. The final damning piece was a transcript of a covert audio recording, a conversation in which Klaus had trapped Weber into admitting he had a direct line to the Americans. It was an airtight case, a prosecutor's dream, assembled by a man who knew he might not live to present it himself. Possessing the truth and delivering justice, however, were two vastly different things. The evidence was irrefutable, but the system it was meant for was irrevocably compromised. To hand this microfilm over to the BND would be to deliver it directly into the hands of Weber's allies, ensuring its immediate and permanent burial. The German federal police would be hamstrung by layers of national security protocols, their investigation likely quashed before it even began. Anton Weber was not just a man, he was an institution, a pillar of the state, protected by decades of carefully cultivated alliances and the deep-seated institutional desire to never again air the dirty laundry of the Cold War. Conventional justice was a locked door, and Weber held the only key. They had the weapon, but they were standing in a battlefield where all the official referees were on the opposing team. It was Sarah who saw the only viable path forward, a strategy born from the modern asymmetrical warfare of information. "We can't win in a courtroom," she stated, her voice resonating with a newfound hard-edged certainty as she paced the small hotel room. "So we won't fight there. We'll fight in the open, in the court of public opinion. We leak it. All of it." Her plan was audacious and incredibly dangerous. She would write the story, a comprehensive, evidence-backed exposé, and use her most trusted international contacts to publish it simultaneously in major newspapers in Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom. By releasing the information on a global scale, they would make suppression impossible. It would create a political firestorm so massive that not even a man as powerful as Anton Weber could hope to contain it. It was their only shot, a journalistic declaration of war against a man who commanded an army of spies. The days that followed were a blur of frantic, clandestine activity. From the temporary sanctuary of their hotel room, they became the nerve center of a covert media operation. Sarah wrote with a feverish, relentless focus, her fingers flying across her encrypted laptop, weaving Klaus Richter's evidence into a powerful, undeniable narrative. Ethan worked alongside her, providing the deep historical context and the profound, emotional core of the story, the tale of a son's search for his father. They painstakingly digitized every frame of the microfilm, creating an unassailable dossier of proof. Finally, on a cold Tuesday morning in October 2004, they sent the encrypted files to their journalistic allies. They hit send, and for a long, silent moment they could only wait, knowing they had just lit the fuse on a bomb that would either liberate them or consume them in its blast. The explosion was immediate and spectacular. The headlines detonated across the global news landscape, sending shockwaves through the political establishments of Berlin and Washington. The Lynx unmasked, German intelligence chief exposed as Cold War traitor. The ghost of the Stasi, how a dead man cipher rewrote history. Anton Weber's carefully constructed world, his legacy as a hero of German reunification, was vaporized in a matter of hours. He appeared on television, his face a mask of controlled fury, vehemently denying the allegations, branding the story a malicious fabrication and a, quote, character assassination. But the evidence was too specific, too overwhelming. The release of the audio recording, forensically verified by multiple independent labs, was the final, fatal blow. The voice of the traitor, captured 18 years earlier, was now damning him in the digital age. The institutional walls that had protected Anton Weber for so long began to crumble under the relentless pressure of global public outrage. A formal parliamentary inquiry was launched. Weber was suspended from his duties at the BND and, within a week, was forced to tender his resignation in utter disgrace. Yet, the imperfect nature of systemic justice became painfully clear. Citing the statute of limitations on espionage cases from the GDR era and the political delicacy of the situation, the German government never brought formal charges. There was no trial for treason, no conviction for murder. Anton Weber, the man who had betrayed his country and orchestrated the assassination of his colleague, was simply allowed to vanish, disappearing into a quiet, luxurious exile, his freedom the final, bitter price of political expediency. The system, in the end, had still found a way to protect its own from true accountability. For Ethan, the absence of a prison sentence was not a defeat. Justice, he realized, came in many forms. He stood before a packed press conference in Berlin, not as an avenger, but as a son finally able to speak the truth. He read a prepared statement, his voice clear and steady, formally and publicly clearing his father's name. He told the world about Klaus Richter, the brilliant patriot who had foreseen the corruption within his own government and had given his life in an attempt to stop it. He presented his father not as a spy, but as a man of conscience. With those words, the 18-year-old lie that had defined his existence was officially dead. Klaus Richter, the traitor, was gone. In his place stood Klaus Richter, the hero. The crushing weight of shame Ethan had carried since childhood evaporated, replaced by a profound, quiet pride that settled deep in his soul. The resolution rippled outwards, reshaping the lives of all who had touched the ghost machine. Sarah Jenkins, propelled by the biggest intelligence scoop of the decade, became one of the most respected investigative journalists in the world, a relentless voice against the abuses of institutional power. In his small Pankow apartment, Stefan Brandt finally unchained his door, the fear that had been his jailer for nearly 2 decades, banished by the public truth. He lived his final years in peace, his promise to Klaus honored, his testimony a vital piece of the historical record. The Richter Enigma, as it came to be known, was acquired by a museum where Dr. Evelyn Reed often lectured, explaining to captivated audiences how a relic from one war was used to deliver a final victorious message in another. The machine had fulfilled its purpose. Back in his quiet study in Washington, D.C., Ethan looked at the space on his desk where the Enigma had once sat. The machine was now a museum piece, but its presence lingered, no longer a dark harbinger of a painful past, but a silent monument to his father's love and ingenuity. The investigation had forced him to confront the ghost he had spent a lifetime running from, and in doing so he had found not a traitor, but a man of incredible courage. He had finally met his father. A sense of profound peace settled over him, a quiet closure that was more complete than any legal verdict. The questions that had haunted him were answered. The shame was gone. The silence in his home was no longer the sound of emptiness, but the sound of a story, finally, peacefully, at its end. The fall of Anton Weber did more than just clear one man's name. It forced a painful but necessary national conversation in Germany. The affair cracked open the carefully sealed history of reunification, exposing the uncomfortable truth that many powerful figures from the old regime had not been vanquished, but had simply been absorbed into the new one, their pasts sanitized for the sake of stability. Klaus Richter's story became a powerful symbol, a reminder that the past is never truly past, and that its unresolved injustices continue to exert a gravitational pull on the present. It was a testament to the enduring power of a single, determined voice, amplified by a ghost in a machine, to hold even the most powerful to account, proving that no truth can remain buried forever if someone is brave enough to start digging. Years later, the silence in Ethan Hayes' study felt different. The space on his mahogany desk, where the Enigma machine had once sat, a dark and heavy presence, was now just a polished surface reflecting the quiet lamplight. The machine was gone, a public artifact in a museum, but its ghost remained, not as a source of dread, but as a quiet companion, a testament to a father he had finally come to know through a language of rotors and wires. The frantic, desperate race across Berlin had faded into a series of sharp, indelible memories, the chaos replaced by a profound and hard-won peace. The world outside, with its academic calendars and political cycles, continued its predictable rhythm. but the world inside him had been fundamentally and irrevocably rebuilt. The shame that had been the foundation of his life was gone, replaced by a bedrock of truth. The justice they had achieved was not the clean, satisfying verdict of a Hollywood film. Anton Weber, the man known as the Lynx, never saw the inside of a courtroom. He was never charged with treason, never held accountable for the murder of Klaus Richter. Instead, he was consumed by a firestorm of public disgrace, his career vaporized, his name transformed from a symbol of patriotic service into a byword for Cold War treachery. He was allowed to retreat into a wealthy, anonymous exile, a ghost of a different sort, stripped of his power, but not his freedom. For some, it was an incomplete victory, a bitter reminder that the system is designed, above all, to protect itself from scandal. But for Ethan, destroying the lie was more important than caging the liar. He had reclaimed his father's story, and that was a justice of its own. In the German Museum of Technology in Berlin, the Richter Enigma now sits behind climate-controlled glass. It is one of the most popular exhibits, a silent, black machine that tells a story of two different wars. It was forged in the fires of one global conflict and became the final, decisive weapon in a quiet, personal battle fought decades later. School children and tourists press their faces to the glass, marveling at its mechanical complexity, while a small plaque beside it tells the story of Klaus Richter, the Stasi cryptographer, who used this relic to send a final, incorruptible message from beyond the grave. The machine, once a vessel of state secrets and private grief, had become a public monument to the idea that history is a living thing, its dormant artifacts capable of speaking truth to a new generation, waiting only for the right hands to turn the key. The ripples of that truth reshaped the lives of everyone it touched. Sarah Jenkins became a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, her name synonymous with fearless investigative reporting, forever chasing the ghosts hidden within the corridors of power. In his small Pankow apartment, Stefan Brandt lived out his final years in quiet peace, the suffocating fear that had been his jailer for 2 decades finally banished by the public vindication of his friend. Dr. Evelyn Reed continued her work at Georgetown, but her lectures on historical ciphers now carried a new weight, a profound understanding of the human dramas, the love, betrayal, and courage encoded within the cold mathematics of her machines. They had been drawn together by one man's desperate last act, and they moved forward forever, bonded by the truth they had unearthed together, custodians of a ghost's legacy. The fall of the Lynx did more than just clear one man's name. It sent a seismic shock through the political establishment of a unified Germany. The affair became a painful but necessary catalyst for a national reckoning, forcing the country to confront the uncomfortable reality that the clean, triumphant narrative of reunification had been built over a foundation of dark compromises and buried secrets. Klaus Richter's story became a powerful, cautionary tale, taught in universities and debated in political circles, a symbol of integrity in a system rife with moral ambiguity. It was a stark reminder that the past is never truly dead, and that its unresolved injustices exert a powerful, gravitational pull on the present, waiting for a single loose thread to unravel the entire, carefully woven tapestry of official history. Ethan Hayes was a changed man. The quiet, emotionally guarded academic who had used history as a shield against his own life was gone. The journey into his father's past had forced him to confront his own, breaking down the walls he had so carefully constructed. He began to visit Berlin not as a researcher but as a son, walking the streets of his childhood with a sense of connection rather than dread. He looked at the few faded photographs he had of his father, not with the familiar sting of shame, but with a deep, quiet pride. He was no longer a man living in the shadow of a traitor's legacy. He was simply Klaus Richter's son, and for the first time in his life, that identity felt like a source of strength, a heritage of courage he was now proud to claim as his own. Yet, a few threads of the conspiracy remained stubbornly in the dark. While Anton Weber had been exposed, the full extent of the Phoenix network, the names of the agents he had sold to the CIA, the operational damage he had caused, remained classified, locked away in the deepest vaults of the BND and Langley. The official story was that the case was closed, a historical footnote from a bygone era. But Ethan knew that intelligence networks were like living organisms. Cutting off the head did not always kill the body. Shadows lingered at the edges of the official narrative. Unanswered questions about who else had known, who else had benefited from Weber's treason, and what other secrets were still being protected by the silent, mutual pact of former enemies. The war was over, but the peace felt fragile, conditional. One evening, a year after the story broke, an anonymous, encrypted email appeared in his inbox. It contained no sender, no subject line, just a single, chilling sentence. The links may be caged, but the nest is still active. The message hung on his screen, a digital ghost whispering a new warning. It could have been from anyone, a former colleague of his father's, a rival of Weber's, or even a new player in a game he thought was over. It was a stark reminder that a conspiracy is more than just one man. It is a structure, a network of shared secrets and mutual protection that can survive the fall of its leader. The email was not an ending, but a question, a suggestion that his father's work of hunting ghosts from within the system was not yet finished. And this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Ethan closed the laptop, the message burning in his mind. He walked to his study window, looking out at the quiet, peaceful suburban street. The world was the same, but he was not. He was no longer a man haunted by a question, but a man defined by the truth he had fought to uncover. The journey had taught him that history is not a static collection of facts in a book, but a relentless, ongoing battle between memory and silence, between the stories we tell and the secrets we keep. His father had run his leg of that race until he was silenced. Now a new message had arrived, a potential new cipher waiting to be solved. His father's last cipher was solved, but the coded language of power and secrecy remained, waiting for the next person brave enough to break it.